So the quadratic formula is another way to solve quadratic equations. The completing the square method is a great method and super important, and we're going to show why it's so important. One of the reasons, because it allows us to have the next technique, which is the quadratic formula. For some people, they like the quadratic formula better. It's a little bit more straightforward application of finding the answers. But it's definitely a formula and not necessarily a concept or an idea to solving them. So with the quadratic formula, we start by saying we want to find the solution to a general quadratic equation. And that general quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c. And right now, the only way we know how to do that is to either factor it or to have it as a perfect square so that we can take the square root of both sides. Well, factoring we can't do on this. And so instead what we're going to do is we're going to do the quadratic, the completing the square method. Well, if you remember, when you complete the square, you're going to go through and divide through everything by a. And we do that so we get this coefficient of 1. And so that means our coefficient of x is b over a. And then our constant is c over a. And so just like when we completed the square, we're going to subtract both sides by c over a. Now, to complete the square, if you remember, what we do is we take half of the middle term, the x coefficient, not the x, but the coefficient, so b over a. So half of b over a is just b over 2a. And we square it, and that gives us b squared over 4a squared, right? Half of b over a is like multiplying by 1/2. That's b over 2a. And then when you square that, it is b squared, and then 2a times 2a is 4a squared. Remember that when you're doing the completing the square, whatever you add to one side, you have to add to the other side. Now we factor this. We have the helpful trick where the factorization, the perfect square factorization, is always just x plus or minus half that middle term. And so half of b over a, again, is b over 2a. So it's going to be x plus b over 2a squared. That's how this factors. I'm going to put these together because it's going to make my life easier. So I'm going to do 4a times 4a on that negative ca. So I get a common denominator of 4a squared. And I end up with b squared, this, minus 4ac all over 4a squared. Just added those fractions together. Now I take the square root of both sides, and I get x plus b over 2a equals, well, the square root of this. We imposed a square root, so we got to put plus or minus. And then the square root of 4a squared just turns out to be 2a. So now the last thing I do for this is I subtract the b over 2a, and I get x equals a negative b. The denominators are the same, so I can put these together into one fraction, minus plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Where a, b, and c are simply the coefficients of the x squared term, the x term, and then the constant. And all you have to do to find your two answers is plug this in like this. So let's do one example problem where we know some other ways of doing it. So a really super easy one, x squared minus 4x minus 12 equals 0. So let's do all three ways now that we could solve a problem like this, because we also know a factoring method of solving, right? Well, this one lends itself easily to factoring. So let's do it first. So x minus 6 times x plus 2 equals 0. So x equals 6 and negative 2. So that's the easiest way for this particular problem to solve it. But we could have also completed the square. And so remembering this completing the square technique, we would have done, right, added 12 to both sides. Half the middle term, half of negative 4 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared is 4. So we add 4 to both sides. Factor that, we get x minus 2 squared equals 16. Now, because we completed the square, we can take the square root of both sides. We get x minus 2 equals plus or minus 4. We add 2 to that, and we get x equals positive 4 plus 2, which is your 6, negative 4 plus 2, which is negative 2. So that was a good way to do it. A little bit more work than this other one. And then the last way is to use the quadratic formula. And you're going to need to start spending some time doing this. There are some pretty cool videos if you get on YouTube and say, look up quadratic formula songs. There's a lot of people out there that have created songs to help you memorize what this formula, but you do 100% need to memorize that formula. And so it's negative b. So in this case, for this problem, a equals 1, b equals negative 4, c equals negative 12. So it's negative, our x value using quadratic formula is negative b, so negative of a negative 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, negative 4 squared, which is 16, minus 4ac. 4 is 1, or a is 1, c is negative 12, all over 2a, a is just 1. So that gives me 4 plus or minus square root of, well, this turns out to be 64, right? Negative 4 times 1 times negative 12 is positive 48, so 16 plus 48, all over 2, which then gives me 4 plus or minus 8 all over 2, which also gives you 6 negative 2. So we solved this really basic quadratic in 3 different ways, all getting the same answer, all verifying those are nice techniques to use. So the quadratic formula, well, it can be used in lots of different ways. So first off, just a real basic one, 2x squared plus x minus 3 equals 0. So actually, let's change that to minus 4 equals 0. So it gives us irrational answers. So when we look at this, the first thing you always want to do in using the quadratic formula is get what your a is, what your b is, what your c is. I highly recommend, as you're doing these problems, rewriting the quadratic formula for the first few problems at least, if not for all of them, so that it helps you remember what it is. So b was 1, so it gives you negative 1 plus or minus square root of b squared, which is 1, minus 4 times a times negative 4. Be very, very, very careful of your negatives. That is the spot where people make mistakes on this. It's minus 4ac. And so you make sure you pay attention. Is a positive or negative? Is c positive or negative? And then all over 2 times 2. Remember, a is 2. And so that equals negative 1 plus or minus square root of 33 over 4, and you are done. And that is the correct answer there. And so it worked out really nicely for that problem. Another place where the quadratic formula is super useful is one like this. 1/3 x squared plus 3/5 x minus 4/15 equals 0. So on this one, if you went through and tried to complete the square on it, you would multiply through by 3 so that you can get that x squared term as having a coefficient of 1. But it leaves you with other fractions, and it gets pretty messy pretty quick. Whereas for the quadratic formula, you don't want to deal with fractions because that's going to get complicated. But instead, you can just go through and get rid of the denominators by multiplying by 15, and you get 5x squared plus 9x minus 4 equals 0. And now this is a very easy problem to put into quadratic formula, right? It's, remember, rewrite the formula, negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. It does have a musical feel to it when you say it a lot. So b is 9, and so x is going to equal negative 9 plus or minus square root of b squared, which is 81, minus 4 times 5 times negative 4 all over 2 times 5, which gives you negative 9 plus or minus square root of, this turns out to be positive 80, so 161 all over 10. And you are done. 161. Now, if you can simplify the square root, then you need to simplify the square root. and keep going. If you get a negative inside the square root, then your answer is no solution. If the problem asks for you to round to the nearest tenth or hundredth, then you need to go through and type it into your calculator. And you have to make sure that you do the plus and the minus, because there are two solutions here. And then the last thing I would suggest to you is there is a mistake that's sometimes made in that you get into these problems and then you say, okay, my b is 9x, but the b is not 9x. Your answer should never have x in it. The b is just 9, not 9x.